Welcome to the What We Do Now podcast. What We Do Now is a creative placemaking network in Dumfries and Galloway. We connect people, creatives and community groups, providing support and resources to help everyone work together to create a fairer, more connected community. In this special episode, Matt Baker, founder and CEO of the Stove Network, and Katharine Wheeler, Development Director and What We Do Now lead, discuss the origins and evolution of the Stove from outsider to a part of the cultural establishment. They explore the civic role culture plays in communities and look at the future of creative placemaking.
Matt, you are our longest standing founding member of the Stove Network and have really held an oversight and caretaking of our vision since the beginning. Personally, it's been working with you and being part of shaping that vision that really uncovered my own passion in what we now talk about as creative placemaking. So it's great to get this chance to talk to you about that today, particularly at this time of transition for the Stove before you move on to other things. So it'd be good to talk about that vision, the creative practice you've brought to it, how that informs the approaches and methods used in what is quite a different way of working with people and community, and some of the lessons and learnings you take from that we can share. Your thoughts on where it's brought us to in Scotland in terms of the civic role that culture can play in communities.
Lovely.
So, firstly, it would just be really interesting to hear what inspired you at the beginning of the Stove as an individual. I know I've heard you talk, and I'm sure others have, about the story of how we started as an organisation, but it would really be interesting to hear you talk about that from your own perspective.
Okay, thank you for having me. This is funny. Okay, where to start? So my practice as an artist, I was never what you might describe as a gallery artist. So I never sort of went and made things in my own space and then tried to interest people in those things and sell them to them or show them. There always had to be a context with me. And I had a thing when I was young that I wanted to be useful. I used to say to people, as an artist, I want to be as useful as a plumber. I want to be part of society and I want to be useful. So I only worked to commission, basically. So if people wanted an artist to be involved in something, that was what I did. So fast forward quite a long way, because there's a whole story there. My life became public art, meaning that I was being commissioned by local authorities, regeneration projects, those kind of things. And the larger sort of pieces that I was involved with became kind of like artwork strategies. So I was involved in the regeneration of the Gorbals. We ran an art strategy for that, a Percent for Art program. And also in Inverness, I was the lead artist for the city centre in Inverness. Now, all of those projects were quite traditional in the sense that there was a budget for a project and I used that budget to involve as many people as I possibly could, because what I was really interested in was that social impact and getting people involved. But always it came to an end. The money ran out and then you moved on and you went somewhere else. And I used to be in a conversation with a few other public artists about that, about we want to be part of making a wider impact, and yet we're restricted by this project funding. So how can you make something sustainable in a place? How can you make something that starts to generate its own project, generate its own income, and then become sustainable as a thing? So that was, as an artist, that was my objective with the Stove, was to try and embed the practice in a place, and then for that practice to be seen as being useful enough that people wanted to keep it going, whether that was the people that were involved in it, the people that were funding it, the partners that were working with it. It was transferring that idea of being a plumber and being useful to the idea of an arts organisation within a place. And Dumfries sorely needed something to happen.
Yeah, and that's, such a, I think, refreshing way of, certainly has resonated with me as a creative practitioner about that use. I didn't want to work in isolation, and that's what really drew me to the work of the Stove in the first instance. It was that use that you could have as part of a wider place, society, and how you would bring your skills into a different way of working with the people in the community around you. You did some quite groundbreaking work when you were the town artist in Inverness, and then the work that you did in Glasgow, where that public art, that practice was really embedded in quite big infrastructure, place development projects. How did the context and community in Dumfries, is there something that Dumfries brought that was new to your work in terms of that inquiry? I mean, obviously you've spoken about that long-term piece, but is there something specific about the context of Dumfries that really fed into that inquiry here?
Absolutely, because the context was so different, particularly different to Glasgow. I mean, anybody that's worked in public art in Glasgow will know it. It doesn't get much better than Glasgow. I mean, you can go on the street and start doing something and people are immediately interested in and engaged, you know, just because that's what Glaswegians are like. And it's kind of wonderful. Dumfries was completely different. But what first inspired me about Dumfries actually was way before stove times, because, you know, I'd been living here for quite some time before the stove. I made a piece on the river called The Crossing that involved a sort of granite carving being set into the side of the river. And it meant being on site to install that work, you know, which is the sort of classic thing where you're sort of inside a fenced enclosure and you're sort of a bit like a sort of monkey on show to the population going by. And there were particularly older people were walking by and were asking what we were doing. And often my experience before had been that that question had been really quite a throwaway question that was actually angled just to get a response so that you could complain about the council wasting money or something like that. But actually in Dumfries, what I found was people really wanted to know in that first instance. They wanted to hear the story of what you were doing, who you were, and why you were doing what you were doing and what it was about. And I was actually really kind of inspired by that. And I've always said about the communities around Dumfries and Galloway, and Dumfries and Galloway is somewhere that I am deeply in love with, is that sense of community in the traditional, probably quite cliched sense of people coming together to do things and look after each other is only just still below the surface. Whereas I think if you look at a lot of city places in particular, it's been lost further back. You know, you can still scratch that sense of like, we know each other, we know who we are, we know why we're here, and we care about it. It's still just below the surface. And so I felt that it would be relatively easy to scratch that with an art project like the stove. I was wrong in the first instance, because what I hadn't anticipated was why things were below the surface was that I think people had become really quite radically disempowered and really felt that they'd lost agency about the place they were in. Things were being done to them rather than them being involved in doing them. And when Stove tried to start a conversation about what do you think about Dumfries and what would you do about it and how would you change it and how would you be part of changing it, we just got told, you're wasting your time, pal, and don't get people's hopes up because nothing's really going to change. And we had to shift into more of an empowerment thing to start with. Doing daft things like lighting bonfires in the town square just to sort of provoke people into saying, well, you can't do that. Well, yes, you can do that, you know, and it's a public space. And I think also with the context of Dumfries, the thing was that because of the scale of it, I think if you make a small change or make something begin to happen, you can see the impact of that change much more clearly than you can in a bigger place, say. And I felt that that was really helpful for the idea of growing some kind of structure, the fact that its impact could be seen quite quickly, you know, that you weren't banging your head against something for years and years and years until you saw some change. You could do something and you could see a change.
That's really interesting, because obviously people often ask us at the Stove how we do what we do and how that could maybe help them think about what they're doing in their places. And I think it's really important to be hearing about some of those nuance, those sort of complexities, that context that really contributed and that you responded to and that the Stove responded to in terms of really embedding the work here and building that shared community around the work that we do. You've talked a little bit about some of the challenges, one of them being that disempowerment of people, but could you say a little bit more about how did some of those early challenges of the Stove, how did those experiences really shape the organisation's values and what we would call probably the values of creative placemaking?
Yeah, I think there were really deep challenges within the people, really, I would say. Inherently, creative people are not joiners, they're awkward buggers who want to go their own way, and the Groucho Marx thing, I would never be a member of a... Exactly. So trying to find ways of holding initially a small group of people who needed that energy, that nucleus together, but all the time being conscious that that group had to be always outward looking so that it didn't become a very inward looking clique. Those were the serious challenges of listening, but also holding the energy, because if you just were listening all the time and thinking about stuff that was a long way away, you were lost. You lost some of that dynamism of the internal energy. So in terms of your question about shaping the values, I think it was, how do you hold something together closely and retain energy, but also keep listening to the outside? And obviously, early doors, we all started with a vision of something called the Stove. But, initially there were 5 of us who really invested time and energy. I'm not sure that we ever really knew what each other's vision of it, the thing was. We kind of held on to this thing that we called the Stove. And I think the tensions in that became unbearable for some people, and people left. And I think, what the Stove does now is quite regularly reassert the values that it has and make sure that everybody is on the same page or has a chance to tweak the vision and the mission. And we're much more open, I think, now about what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. I think those early days, we really didn't know. I mean, I guess I had quite a strong vision, but I would have really struggled to articulate that in terms of a kind of cohesive idea for a structure which everybody could be part of and that would make sense to people that were out with the arts or people that were inside the arts. Yeah. So the processes that we went through of negotiating who we were, why we were, and how we communicated with everybody else, that was the stuff.
The foundation of those values. And I can certainly, obviously the Stove has changed a lot since Martin and I joined 10 years ago, and there was still very much that sort of arts collective feel when we joined what was the curatorial team, and we've changed a huge amount in the last 10 years. But those values that you talk about that have come out of those challenges around making sure, maybe not having an answer, but making sure that we have the right spaces to revisit that vision together, to listen to what our different perspectives of that might be, and to also bring our community and bring that into the work. How are we, that's actually almost become a foundation, hasn't it, of how we work within the community.
I really remember when you and Martin joined, you really made it your own sort of personal mission to sort of understand what the Stove was and communicate it to the outside world. And that's been really common. People coming in people don't get it. We need to properly explain it clearly so that people really understand it. But there's something, when you and I did that work with Queen Margaret University about that, what was it called?
Translator and the boundary crossing role of the Stove.
But I think there's something really positive about the fact that people can sort of understand it in a way that makes sense to them or that they want to see it. And that has always been useful to us as a strategy of okay, if you want to see it like that, that's okay. It's not actually antithetical to something that we are. It might not be the way that I describe it or you describe it, but if that is useful to you to talk about it in that way, that works for us. That's okay. And I think there's something really valuable in that slightly blurred quality to it, which is where the values come in of the values are so strong. And I'm constantly fascinated that people can look at something and say, oh yeah, that's a Stove piece of work. I can see that's a Stovey thing, and you're kind of like, well, what is it about, because we do so many different things. And it's what is it? What's the quality that you can see that makes that Stove thing? I can't put my finger on it.
No, and it's really interesting because obviously we have sometimes tried to respond to that, what is the Stove, by pinning it down. But actually we have always come back to how important it is that it's different things for different people, because it's about different different ways that people need to connect and participate. And if we're looking at trying to be as wide and diverse and as inclusive as possible, then we have to have different languages, have different spaces, have different things that come to the fore in terms of the work and priorities, don't we?
It was an adapter. Was the thing that QMU coming up with, yeah.
Which we've used quite a lot since, that sort of adapter.
Which is why we can't remember it.
Mm-hmm. So, obviously I referred to, we started as an arts collective and we're now an organisation of 21 staff, which is quite frightening actually sometimes, but also quite empowering and exciting. How has your background as a practicing artist? I've always been taken by the fact that you will still introduce yourself in some spaces as, it's been useful to be an artist, or the background that you bring. And you talked about at the beginning of the Stove as sort of embedding that art practice. How has that background informed the approaches that we take into the Stove, do you think, in terms of our governance and our management and the way that we operate as an organisation?
I've actually become more radical and determined about introducing myself as an artist in the last few years, actually, because it actually feels important to me to be saying that artists can practice in this way, and it is arts practice. Because I think the infiltration of arts practice into society is one of the things that I really hope that the Stove would do, would start to challenge some of the ways that we do things. And I think that's where the sort of connect to the governance is really important, that the qualities of risk-taking and collaboration and acknowledging emotion, all of that stuff is actually part of the way that we function as an organisation. And that is what I see my artist practice being about. But there's also a side of my artist practice which is about making and about scale. I'm a sculptor, and scale is one of the inherent qualities of sculpture. And so being able to scale up an approach to something like a large scale regeneration project in Stranraer is part of my practice, and not being afraid to go, oh God, we can't touch that. That's huge. It's enormous, and the understanding of that scale and how things can translate at scale, and the importance of actual making, the quality of constructing things, putting things together. That's the way that I think, in the way that I'm thinking about working with people as well, of putting things together and making combinations of things. And that's my way of being.
Oh, it's really interesting to hear you talk about it, because that's quite a scary thing for a lot of people, to scale something up. It's like, it's one thing to do your own little thing, to keep it contained, but to really be able to blur the edges of what it is, to make it very visible, to scale up, to invite others into it, to think about how that approach can maybe be replicated or used. That's when we think about scalability, that's often what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's super interesting. You have a painting practice which has ideas of composition and colour and representation, and Martin has a performance background. Those things shape the interactions that we make with people and the way that we think about working with people, I think.
And often we've talked about actually the excitement and the comfortableness that we have with the unknown that we bring into the work that we do as well, of that sort of, we like to play with ideas. We like to think about how that might provoke or inspire, and we're comfortable with not knowing what that's going to look like. And we've always talked about how important it is to have other people bringing different experiences into the work of the Stove, but that's one of the things that people who identify as artists and have that creative practice are often bringing into that space.
Yeah, I like the way you talk about that in terms of being comfortable with the mess. That's how we learn our art practices. We don't know what we're making. We don't set out to know what we're making with that. And I've used this phrase a lot, of the usefulness of uselessness, in terms of that art practice as well, in the context of working with local authorities and things like that. No, as an artist, nobody expects you to do anything useful, so you are constantly able to surprise, and you get in under the radar because people are not so wary of you. They're wary of the fact of the uncertainty, but they're not wary that you're going to kind of necessarily impose a road on them because you come with a badge that says I'm a road engineer, you know.
There's something that I think almost, there is that wariness, but sometimes I think there's a curiosity that we can sort of spark in people by that unknownness as well. And we've talked about how we then use that as a practice to bring people who might not normally come into a form of sort of more traditional place development consultation or work, you know, because we're inspiring that curiosity of bringing people
hopefully
together.
that is, and I'll let you get to your next question. But hopefully, you know, that idea of infiltrating systems and making the way that we do things as a society better, more humane, more understandable, more accessible, is about having fun. You know, it's like this stuff can be enjoyable. We're not just have to spend our work lives waiting for 5 o'clock. You know, we can do stuff that is fun. And if you're working with people that are fun, that are making that fun and engaging and challenging, and then I think that is as valuable as anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we've touched on it, but my next thing that I thought would be interesting to talk about is that, is it important for you? I think I probably know the answer to this through what you've said already, to hold on to that. Well, you've already actually talked about the importance of holding on to that identity as an artist. But, you know, can you talk a bit more about the ways that you've needed to feed your own creativity, or the ways that you've found to feed that, inspire your creativity, and how you've maybe brought that into your work, or how you've tried to bring that in?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because I think I've experienced my practice as an artist changing. You know, I've become more focused on organizational structures and strategic approaches to things, less kind of like hands-on stuff. So feeding the creativity around that has been looking to other examples of where those things happen in an interesting way, like sports management or whatever. So it's become, I've gone on all sorts of interesting journeys. And it's funny now, as I'm thinking about changing that, of like how I'm suddenly switching now to like, I'm looking at making processes again in a quite obsessive way, rather than thinking about how do you get the best from a team, or how do you maintain the freshness and creativity and dynamism of a team. And I feed my creativity by being on my own, by riding my bike, being out in the landscape, listening to music. It's about getting into a sort of flow state in my head, and I don't know how it works. And I mean, it's something that you have to look after, and I'm bad at looking after it. I did some therapy at one time, and I ended up referring to my creativity as in terms of me being like a lion tamer. And I kind of like had this kind of poor sort of mangy lion that was trapped, that I would sort of like, I wasn't treating very well, and I was pulling it out and making it perform. And I'm tired.
But that's really interesting, because hearing you talk about how you feed your creativity, for me, opens up that question about how expansive creativity is. And we've often talked about that a lot as well here, is that it's not useful to put it in this box of it is painting, it is making a thing. It is, for some people it's that, but actually when we talk about creativity, we talk about it in its widest possible sense. It's that self-expression, it's that connection with people, it's that identity. So to feed your own practice, if that's your passion, if it's that broader thing, then it can be gardening or cycling, or researching the way that sports do participation in communities. And I've also felt really excited by gathering that information and talking to similar minds. I often find that I get really excited talking to social geographers. They're always coming from arts and humanities. Like, we've got the same sort of thoughts. So it's that wider way that we can feed what we do.
But I always find the question with that is all those things almost like try to deny that they're creative.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the biggest ones for me is archaeology. It's like archaeology tries to present itself as a science and fact, and yet you're looking at a lump of something, and you're trying to interpret what that lump of something was, and that is almost like the definition of an imaginative act. I mean, okay, there's some evidence that you're working from or whatever, but geography would be another one. I would see all of that. I mean, I think it's interesting being in the Scottish context because this is the home of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment in the 18th century split everything up into disciplines. Before that, you did a bit of science, you did a bit of art, and that was what everybody did. And then we suddenly became, okay, you're a geologist, you're a physicist, you're a writer, and I think we need to reverse that. I mean, I think Scotland has a responsibility to the planet to sort of put that back together again after breaking it apart.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. Moving slightly on, but just focusing on the Stove and the creative projects that we've done, is there one or some that have felt especially personal or pivotal for you?
I think actually that's always a really hard question because I'm very fond of lots of different projects, but I think some of the sort of more weirdly unexpected ones, particularly stuff around the river. There was that We Live With Water project where a few people came together to look at different ways of approaching that flooding question, which was a long time ago. We're talking about over 10 years ago. And suddenly came up with a publication that said, well, let's look at Dumfries 50 years in the future, where we've actually decided that water is what we're about, and we're going to completely adapt ourselves to welcoming the water instead of trying to hold it at bay. And, in terms of that creative placemaking thing, I think that was a real lesson for me of how you could change the conversation, because our MP at the time took that piece of work down to Westminster and said, look, this is what's happening in Dumfries and the way that we're talking about water, which was really unexpected. And then there's been the Nith Ray River Festival and all. And now we're working with the show people about maintaining the Rood Fair and the Spring Fair on the White Sands by the river in its traditional home. So we've, in terms of that real in-depth placemaking work, that has really answered for me that thing of can you maintain a practice in a place, and what's the value of that? We've got a significant archive now of work connected to the river. We are one of the sort of sources of local knowledge about all of that in a cultural sense, and there's so much value in that.
And speaks to what we were talking about previously, about that really broad collection of things that are really important in terms of heritage, archaeology, place, community. And I think that portfolio of projects that the Stove has really speaks to that variety. So you've already sort of touched on maybe that more national impact, or certainly our ambition and intent, or sometimes surprise at how some of that work has been taken, as you said, down to Westminster. But I think it's fair to say that the Stove is nationally recognised for its what we would call creative placemaking practice. How would you define creative placemaking, which is how we've started to talk about our work, that broad engagement, creative engagement, community engagement? How would you define that in terms of its core differences from other forms of place development or even socially engaged practice?
Okay, well, the poles that you've created there of socially engaged and place development, I think if you think about in terms of cultural practice, which would be more towards the socially engaged practice, I think the key, it's not so much difference because that implies a sort of judgment, but maybe a sort of defining feature is one of intention. That the intention in the creative placemaking work, as I would see it practiced and talk about it, is that the initial intention is to try and make positive change, positive impact in a situation, in a place, in a community, not to make a piece of art. Yeah. And I think you're using creative techniques and art practices within that. So we'll then come back to the place development thing, but you're not setting out with the overriding intention to make a piece of art. And I think what often gets defined as socially engaged practice starts with that position of I'm going to make a piece of art and I'm going to go out into a community setting in order to do that and use that place and people as part of the techniques and materials that make that piece of work. And that's the fundamental difference. If you come back to the place development thing, the fundamental difference is is creativity, is that it's using the primary technique of using creativity to engage people's participation as a sort of like hands-on, come all ye practice that doesn't immediately squeeze people into particular ways of thinking, which you would maybe get with more traditional placemaking tools, like say the place standard or what is you're already looking at a frame of sort of like common sense. And it's back to that usefulness of uselessness thing. I think you really need to move conversation into the sort of conversation that you would get at 3:00 in the morning after a few drams, which I think creativity can do through building trust and people being part of making something together, as opposed to something which is quite boxy and like, oh, you're asking me that question, I think you want me to give you that answer, and that. So it's giving the freedom to not give the answer that you think is expected, but to look for the unexpected. And that's where it works.
It's that imaginative piece, isn't it? Where, you can't imagine or give yourself permission to imagine change or a different way of doing things unless you've been playful, which we've talked about.
Play is a good word.
Unless you've sort of taken away the boundaries that are often, without us even intentionally realizing, put in place if we're coming into a particular setting to fill out a form or give our opinion on a particular thing. It's those in-between conversations. It's when you bump into people in the pub or, in a public space, or you're coming together to celebrate something and suddenly you start talking about, oh, wouldn't it be interesting if, and that creative practice can help with that imaginative exploration. And you talked about intention as well. And I think that's really important, isn't it? Where the intention is for what do we want to do together? What's the change that we might want to see? What's needed? We're using creative practice as a key mechanism, as a tool, but it's part of a bigger piece of work with lots of other people. So we've talked a little bit about Scotland and some of your work in other places. I think it's an interesting time in Scotland. We're seeing the language of community-embedded practice, creative placemaking being used a lot more frequently. How has your thinking, we'll talk about that national bit in a bit, but how has your thinking over the years evolved? And what do you think makes it particularly powerful for Dumfries and then, I don't know, also maybe wider?
How has my thinking evolved? I think that the evolution in Dumfries that occupies me is, when we started out, we were this sort of plucky outsider, no-hoper, sort of like usefulness of uselessness. And we got a lot of support because people like to sort of like back an underdog. And we were, well, yeah, what harm can it do? And go on yourselves, kind of like, yeah, you go for it. And which was great. And we rode that wave, but with that comes a sort of like, yeah, but we want to be taken seriously. And so we were constantly working away at presenting the right front to the people who wouldn't want to engage with us as the sort of plucky outsider. Then at a certain point, there's been like this sort of tipping point where, certainly in the context of here, I mean, I think in a more national context, it's slightly different, but in the context of here, we have now become part of the establishment. And we are seen as something big, something that has power. We employ 20 odd people. We're a significant sized business. And we've been here quite a long time. We're seen as something that's established. And that means that those attitudes change, and people now feel that they can throw rocks at us in a way that they wouldn't have before, because we were just wee and vulnerable, and well, it's not fair throwing rocks at the wee stovies, And now, yeah. And I like some of the energy around that. I like the fact that some of the younger artists would be kind of like, oh yeah, screw the stove, we're going to do our own thing. We don't want to be part of that. They're the establishment. We're the new thing that's coming up. And I think that's wonderful. But then on the other side, there's the sort of powers that be that were sort of like, that sort of terrible Scottish thing of like wanting to chop the knee, once something is in any way making it, you want to chop it off at the knees and bring it down to size. And who do you think you are. And so in terms of the evolution of my thinking, it's like, well, it's the idea was to set up something and try and make it sustainable. But then, oh God, what happens when it is sustainable? How does it maintain its relevance? How does it maintain its community? Or how does its relationship change to its community? So you see where I'm coming from. It's sort of like, so my thinking about the creative placemaking thing has actually evolved with, and it's like, well, and I've always sort of said, well, the stove only exists as long as the stove has still got a purpose and is still useful. But whatever you try and do, the minute you kind of have grown something, there is a definite dynamic there, which is like, we must protect the thing that we've made. And it must persist. We've got to keep it going. It's kind of like, it's got a board, and the board is kind of like sees itself there as to maintain the thing. But if the thing is an idea, maybe the idea needs to change into something else other than the organization. And so in terms of my thinking, I mean, I'm not in any sense, don't get me wrong, I'm not in any sense thinking that the stove shouldn't exist, because I think there is still a number of very, very good reasons why the stove should still exist, because it means so much to people around here and creates so much in terms of opportunity and is doing good and important and groundbreaking work. So in no sense am I saying that it should stop, but that's where I'm thinking is like how... And how do you join those things up? If other people are doing them elsewhere, how do you grow that the infrastructure to also then make it possible in other places where these things aren't happening? So that's where That's
really interesting. I think there are two main things that stand out to me there. One is back to that scalability where, you can be the sort of little radical provocateur and bring people around, and you're part of the people who are sort of being done to. So, you've got a camaraderie, a commonality in that. And then once you start to become more established, more sustainable, you inevitably move into this more of a position of power where you can affect a different type of change. And actually, if we talk about that long-term change, that long-term scalability, that's really important, but that's a difficult transition. And then how do you then keep that sort of radical core, which we've talked a lot about? And then there's something else around that sort of lifespan. And again, we've talked about not having this perpetual growth model. And I think that we haven't got an answer for that now, but it's really important to keep interrogating. And it reminds me of your personal journey a little bit, where you've, as the main founder and are choosing to move on to other things, you've talked about how important it is to think about that exit strategy. And we also need to be thinking about, what that looks like. Not that we need to exit as an organization, like you say, but what does that look like? Is there a future where the stove is taken up by lots of other things? Is it dispersed? Is it, and we need to be able to stay open to that so we don't feed this perpetual growth.
Great. It's your job now, Kat.
Just a small bit of responsibility there. Okay, so, thinking about that legacy and impact, what are some of the most significant changes you've witnessed in Dumfries and the wider region, would you say, because of the stoves? And not just our work, but the work that we're doing.
Well, there's a list there. I mean, I think, the initial story of this conversation about the town centre, which very directly led to Mid-Steeple Quarter as a project, and the fact that there are now 5 high street buildings that are in community ownership, more than £10 million in inward investment into Dumfries town centre through that project, and the redevelopment of the standard building, 7 new flats on the high street, bringing people back to live. Those are very, very direct impacts, as are the number of opportunities that have been created for freelancers, the freelance community, the number of sort of younger creatives who have come back to live in the region or have been attracted here because of the opportunities that are being created. I started by saying that you can see the difference you make really easily in a smaller community like this. As we have become more part of the infrastructure of how the place works, those changes have become a little harder to see because we don't quite shout about ourselves in quite the same way that we used to about that stuff. So things like the creative placemaking framework, which is a means of the local authority procuring creative engagement with communities to support capital projects in Dumfries and Galloway, I think is a huge impact. And what's being seen there in terms of the changes in the way that regeneration is being done, say somewhere like Stranraer, where, you got the voice of the community front and center in how that change is happening, and that's being facilitated by artists. So, yeah, those are the big legacies.
That's really interesting. Sort of what came into my head is almost the more successful, hopefully, we are in working with and empowering and building capacity in communities, the less visible our work becomes. So a little bit, just sort of briefly, I have huge ambitions for, obviously you referred to the creative placemaking procurement framework. We also published the creative placemaking approach document as a way of putting out our approach to the world, if you like. And I suppose that's with the ambition that we want to see this grow as be supported, in Scotland, because we believe in the impacts it can have that you've just spoken about. What would you say about the future of creative placemaking in Scotland?
Well, it's a super interesting and important moment to be talking about that question, I think, when there is a sort of national review of Creative Scotland going on at the moment, which is hopefully actually a review about how we are thinking and doing culture in Scotland. So often the creative placemaking conversation sits slightly uncomfortably with the culture conversation, because I think it's important to start making distinctions about what the different areas within culture, and that they're not all exactly the same, and so they shouldn't be lumped together. So we do need to be able to see things in isolation and understand the impact that they're making and the reason that they're there. But I think we absolutely have to begin that Creative Scotland conversation with, what are we trying to do? What is culture for? And why are we supporting it? Because I think in Scotland, generalizing, but we went down a line that culture was an industry, that it was seen in economic terms as creative industries, and that was the way to justify the public spend on it, was that it was having an economic impact. And I think that has failed. The Westminster government have just published a new industrial strategy. Creativity and culture is not the headline of the industrial strategy for the UK, right? Let's face it, some culture can make money, but a lot of it doesn't. And okay, what is it there for? If you look at Ireland, they've never really had that conversation. Culture has always been seen as like, well, it's an integral part of who we are and our identity. It binds us together, and it's important that we fund it. We kind of let go of that and went down this line of this industry thing. And how the heck do we get back from that? Because we cannot put the genie back in the bottle on that and kind of go, oh, well, it's all about who we are and our identity. Because that very quickly, in the way that we would now understand culture, becomes a sort of mom and apple pie kind of scenario, and the strategy for that and all the rest of it would be kind of messy. So, and this is where, coming back slightly to the creative placemaking thing, is because I think we need to have, as a society right now, we are dealing with the fact that massive areas, in fact, you could argue, I think, that all of Scotland, probably with the exception of some parts of Edinburgh possibly, are in a situation of being left behind. And we understand as a society, the conversation is moving on from the point of view, like, there is not a one-size-fits-all way of dealing with that. We can't centralize and go, right, we will give everybody this, and this, and they will catch up. That trickle-down economic thing, it never worked. London is still a country mile ahead of everybody else. It's on a different planet. So we actually need to give agency to places and allow places to become their own things, make their own decisions, and take themselves forward. So I think we have to be focusing on culture as a kind of Scottish cultural superpower which accelerates and catalyzes change in places. So I would actually see us allying that to maybe community wealth building as a policy directive, because that community wealth building is in the context in Scotland of the well-being economy, and is therefore, it's not just about wealth in the sense of money, but wealth in the sense of happiness, well-being, opportunities, equalities. So I think it's about reshaping the cultural conversation towards that laser objective of culture in Scotland is a means towards community wealth building and the well-being economy. And then we look at how the structure works to make that happen.
And that plays to, like you've already mentioned, community wealth building, wellbeing economy, things that have been in Scottish policy language for a little while now. So that approach really plays to something that we do have a strong, at least cultural foundation in, which is that community empowerment, that community ownership piece, that sort of socialist values within Scotland. So yes, we maybe made that decision not to invest in culture like Ireland, but it's interesting in our learning with Ireland about how that foundation of community empowerment, community ownership is a really important piece for using culture and creativity as a mechanism, like we've spoken about in this approach, for communities to really shape their places, to develop more healthy and sustainable
It's a much more
ways of
succinct way of
working.
putting it than I whittled on about for ages. So thank you. That's very good. But I think the risk always with that cultural conversation is it's too dispersed. So we will try and have our way with the economic conversation of, yes, culture can make money. We will try and have our way with the education conversation of culture is an inherent part, an important part of the way that we educate people. Health, the value of art in health, the value of in regeneration, in planning, and all of those things. We have to, I think, focus on one clear objective and not be dispersed into, because otherwise we will just get lost. We'll get lost in the cracks.
Whereas that civic agency that everybody should have, and this approach to really catalysing and driving that is really powerful.
Because that works for theatres and galleries and big, it's not that includes everybody. That's not just saying, it's all about grassroots community organisations. It's like if everybody had a responsibility towards shaping the places that they're in, informing the places and being relevant to the places that they're in, then I think that could work.
That could be. So we've transformed Scotland in this conversation. But here's to the future. Okay, so lastly, I sort of wanted to finish up by really thinking about some of the learning from this work. If you were, starting, I suppose I'm thinking here about sharing our learning and any lessons that we feel that we can pass on. So is there anything, because it is constant learning, isn't it? Is there anything that you would share that you would do differently if you were, say, starting again today? Or is there an important piece of learning that you think others could draw on that you would like to share?
I always dreaded this question in the past and really held so tight to the context is half the work, and the context of Dumfries is different to anywhere else. So therefore what we're doing in our region in Dumfries and Galloway can only be for here. But I do think there are principles, and working with you on that creative placemaking approach, I think, we tried to drill down into some of those principles. The one that always comes up for me is the opportunity of space. I think that was fundamental to what made the Stove happen, the fact that there was this building and the building became the opportunity. And I think there are people whose work I respect enormously who take a very radically different view and say actually having a venue holds you down, and so I respect where they're coming from on that. But I fundamentally think it's important to people in the wider community that they can see somewhere that they can come to and be part of and come back to and literally have that door to chap, as I would always say.
It's being a neighbour, isn't it? And being part of our community.
Yeah, I think that the one that's really dead right in terms of, we're part of the town centre community. We are in a community of shops, cafes, and hotels, whatever in the town centre, and we have to look after our building and present it every day in the high street as part of the welcome to Dumfries, and so a lot comes with that. But yeah, you're right. It's being part of that community.
Is there anything that you would say to sort of other artists or individuals that's maybe a bit, we've talked about the way this work requires, what's drawn us, what's drawn you to it. I've talked a little bit about what's inspired me, but and sometimes I talk about how, I suppose one of my bits of advice is that I'm often surprised if people are surprised by the challenges that you come up in this work, and to, it is challenging, and be prepared for that. Be prepared to have to butt up against other people's opinions. Is there anything you'd sort of say as to an individual artist or a community sort of, leader or activist in terms of keeping them going? I suppose maybe it's that rallying call.
Well, I think it is the starting thing that often people really struggle with. And I think what you're saying there about the challenges, and I think quite often people spend maybe too much time trying to prepare themselves for the challenges ahead, and you honestly cannot know them until you face them. So just getting started and then rolling with it. And that's, that has been my practice as an artist, is you just keep starting things and then rolling with the dynamic of, and not all of them work. It's just keep lots of things running, so that you've constantly got energy around you. You're not grinding to a halt and getting stuck. That is the death of this kind of practice, is that you allow yourself to get held up by other forces that you then can't influence, and you're suddenly in a position of stasis. So you have to constantly have lots of different things running.
Yeah. And, be really prepared to explore with people, which really does mean, well, we've talked about play, but back to play again. It's that sort of piece of really not knowing what's going to come and not going away and working it out in a room and then presenting it to people. So it's sharing that accountability, that ownership, that exploration.
And there's a generosity in that of like, I can't do this on my own. I need other people to be involved, and you're going to be genuinely part of shaping this. And then it's that offer and that accountability. Yeah, good point.
Well, it's been brilliant hearing you talk about all that and having this conversation. Quite emotional for me. You've been a huge inspiration in my career, 10 years shaping here at the Stove. And I'm excited to see where you take your work and your experience next, and how the spaces that you'll move into. So just to say, you are moving on from the Stove. Today's your last week. And is there something, sort of a new query or an exploration that excites you, or, what you're taking from your work with us into this next chapter of your life? Or is it just a complete unknown at this point?
Well, I'm sure you're not surprised that I'm getting asked this quite a lot at the moment. I genuinely don't know. So as an artist, the hardest thing for me always was to sit in a studio and try and conjure something. I only work in response to context. So I'm going into a listening phase and looking out for context and opportunity and interest. And I had a very good piece of advice from our chair, the wonderful Lindsay Smith, who said to me, be really careful who you keep company with at this stage, because you be careful not to invite too much fear into your life of people who think, you need to grab at that quickly for, you need to grab that thing because there's money attached to it and security, and you need to keep company with courageous people right now, and who are going to encourage you to keep opening doors instead of closing them. So that's what I'm doing.
What a wonderful piece of advice. We have a wonderful chair. And actually, I think in a way that really can echo us here at the Stove as a new sort of leadership team and space that is going into that listening space, obviously holding the ship, but actually it's that exploration again of what can this look like and what can we do together with a different shape.
And I'm expecting to be inspired by that. I've always been inspired by the people in the Stove and the way that they think and the way that they do things. And I'm fully expecting to be very inspired by what you guys do next with the Stove as an organisation and an idea and a practice.
Shared inspiration. Well, thank you. That's been incredibly special, and I'm really excited to share this with others. But yeah, we'll wrap up there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Kat. That was lovely.
To find out more about what we do now, go to whatwedonow.scot. That's whatwedonow.scot.